Close your eyes for just a moment. Take a deep breath. Can you smell the faint, sweet aroma of steamed buns drifting from a communal kitchen? Can you hear the sharp, clear ring of a bicycle bell echoing down a narrow, sunlit alleyway? Welcome back, my old friend. Today we are going to take a slow, gentle walk down memory lane, stepping back into the China of the 1970s and 1980s. We are going to talk about the everyday rules, the little rituals, and the peculiar habits that governed our daily lives back then. To the young people of today, holding their sleek smartphones, these rules might seem absolutely bizarre. But for us, for those of us who lived through it, these rules were the very heartbeat of our youth. Stay with me until the very end, because we are going to remember a sound that used to dictate the survival of our families, a sound that I promise will bring a warm tear to your eye. Before we begin, let us remind ourselves of how time used to feel. Back then, time did not sprint, it strolled. It was measured not by digital notifications, but by the steady mechanical ticking of a Shanghai wristwatch, or the shifting shadows in the courtyard. People today often look back at our era and think we were poor because our pockets were light and our belongings were few. But they misunderstand the absolute richness of our lives. We possessed a wealth of patience. We had the luxury of deep, unbreakable connections with our neighbors. When you had to wait an entire month for a letter, the arrival of that envelope was a festival for the heart. When you had to save up for years to buy a simple household item, the joy of finally bringing it home was immeasurable. We are not just going to talk about old objects today. We are going to talk about the sincerity, the resilience, and the beautiful shared struggle of a generation that knew how to find magic in the most ordinary things. Let us drift back to the indispensable rule of the ration coupons, the legendary Liang Piao. In the 1970s, having money in your pocket meant very little if you did not have these tiny, fragile slips of paper. I want you to remember the texture of that thin paper between your fingers. It was rough, often worn soft at the edges from being passed from hand to hand. These coupons were the absolute lifeblood of every single family. You could not buy a bowl of noodles on the street, nor could you buy a sack of flour at the store, without handing over the exact denomination of grain coupons. The rule was simple but absolute. No coupon, no food. I remember the meticulous care our mothers took in handling them. They were smoothed out on the table, counted and recounted, and then folded with the utmost reverence into a cloth handkerchief, tucked deep inside a pocket. Losing a grain coupon was not just a financial loss. It was a profound tragedy that meant someone in the household might go hungry that month. It taught us an incredible respect for every single grain of rice, for every steamed bun. Today we simply tap a plastic card or a glass screen to buy mountains of food. But back then, the weight of survival rested on those weightless, beautifully printed little tickets. The anxiety of running out and the profound relief of receiving the monthly allocation bonded families together in a shared mission of careful, deliberate living. Let us turn our minds to the ultimate symbol of pride and mobility on the streets. The heavy, majestic bicycles like the Flying Pigeon or the Phoenix. The unspoken rule back then was that a bicycle was not merely a mode of transportation. It was an honored member of the family. Do you remember the sheer weight of that black steel frame? It was built to last a lifetime. Getting one required not just money, but a highly coveted industrial coupon and endless patience. Once you brought it home, the ritual of care began. Fathers would spend their Sunday mornings with a greasy rag, meticulously polishing the chrome handlebars and the bell until they mirrored the morning sun. The sound of that bell, a sharp, clear ring echoing down a dusty alleyway, is a sound that instantly brings back our youth. The rule was that the bicycle carried everything. You would see a father pedaling, a child sitting on the top tube, the mother riding on the rear rack, and perhaps a heavy sack of winter cabbage strapped to the side. It was a vessel of family unity. When the streets were quiet in the early morning, the rhythmic clicking of thousands of bicycle chains created a soothing, metallic symphony that defined the heartbeat of the city. Today, cars isolate us behind glass and steel, but back then, riding a bicycle meant you were part of the flowing, breathing river of the community, feeling the wind on your face and waving to neighbors. Let us take a moment to reflect on the profound rule of the work unit, known as the danwei. In those days, your workplace was not merely a building you visited for 8 hours a day. It was the entire universe in which your life unfolded. The rule was that the danwei provided everything, and in return, it knew everything about you. Do you remember the feeling of walking through the main gates of the compound every morning? You lived in the housing provided by the unit. You bathed in the communal bathhouse of the unit. Your children went to the unit school, and when you fell ill, you visited the unit clinic. There was no absolute privacy as we understand it today, but there was an incredible, impenetrable safety net. If you wanted to get married, you had to ask the leadership for permission and an official letter. Your colleagues were your neighbors, your friends, and your extended family. You smelled their dinners cooking in the shared hallways, and you heard their children laughing in the courtyards. We were bound together by an invisible, unbreakable thread of mutual reliance. Today, people work remotely, staring at screens in lonely apartments, often not even knowing the names of their next-door neighbors. But back in the 1970s, the danwei meant you were never truly alone, surrounded by a loud, nosy, but deeply caring collective. Now think back to the crisp, chilly winds of November and the absolute, unspoken rule of winter survival. The great cabbage hoarding. Before modern greenhouses brought us every vegetable in the dead of winter, the humble Chinese cabbage was our singular savior. Can you visualize the streets and courtyards suddenly transforming into a sea of green and white? Families would buy hundreds of pounds of cabbage at once. The rule was to carefully lay them out on the sidewalks, the windowsills, and the balconies to dry in the autumn sun. I want you to remember the crisp sound of the outer leaves rustling as our mothers meticulously turned them. The smell of cabbage soup, boiling with perhaps a few precious slices of pork belly, or just a drop of sesame oil, permeated every single stairwell for months on end. We ate it boiled, we ate it stir-fried, we ate it pickled. Sometimes, as children, we complained about seeing the same dish every single day. Yet looking back, the sight of those cabbages stacked like a fortress wall on the balcony brought an immense sense of security. It meant the family was prepared. It meant we would survive the freezing months. Today, seeing perfectly shaped vegetables wrapped in plastic at the supermarket, I cannot help but miss the earthy, raw smell of those autumn days and the collective effort of a family preparing for the long winter together. And what about the strict rule of hot water? In our youth, drinking cold water was practically unheard of. It was an invitation to illness. Thus, the colorful enamel thermos bottle became the centerpiece of every home. Do you recall the heavy glass-lined flask encased in tin, willingly painted with blooming red peonies or mandarin ducks? Every single day involved the ritual journey to the neighborhood boiler room to fetch hot water. I can still hear the squeaking sound of the handle and the sloshing of boiling water as we carefully walked back home. The most vivid memory is the large cork stopper. It had a distinct, woody smell, dampened by the steam. Sometimes, if the water was too hot and the pressure built up, that cork would pop out with a sudden, soft thud in the middle of the night, startling us awake. We used that water for everything, brewing tea leaves that were steeped until they had no flavor left, washing our faces in the morning, and warming our hands around a porcelain mug on freezing winter nights. It was a simple object, yet it held the very warmth of the household. Modern electric kettles boil water in seconds, but they lack the beautiful, painted charm and the slow, deliberate daily ritual of the beloved enamel thermos that stood proudly on our wooden tables. Let us remember the grueling but necessary rule of making and storing honeycomb coal, the feng womei. Before central heating and natural gas, these cylindrical blocks of coal dust and clay were what kept us alive through the bitter cold. The rule was that every family had to manage their coal supply with absolute precision. Do you remember the sharp, slightly acidic smell of sulfur that hung heavy in the winter air? It was the undeniable scent of the season. Families would spend exhausting afternoons pressing the wet, black mixture into molds, leaving them out in the sun to dry. I can still feel the heavy iron tongs in my hands, carefully gripping a fresh briquette to place it into the small, roaring stove. You had to align the holes perfectly so the fire could breathe. It required a delicate touch. Too rough, and the coal would crumble into useless dust. Waking up in the freezing dark to stoke the fire before the family awoke was a profound act of love by our parents. That little stove not only heated the cramped room, but also boiled our water and cooked our meals. The lingering warmth it provided, radiating against the cold brick walls, created a cozy, intimate atmosphere that no modern radiator can ever truly replicate. It was a warmth earned through hard labor and blackened hands. Do you remember the rule of the morning broadcast? The Guangbo Tikao, the synchronized morning exercises that defined our daily rhythm. Long before the sun had fully risen, a sharp burst of static would erupt from the loudspeakers mounted on poles across the courtyards and factory grounds. Then came the energetic, booming voice, accompanied by a bright, brassy, marching tune. The rule was that everyone, from young students to factory workers, stepped outside into the crisp morning air. Can you picture the rows of people, stretching their arms and bending their knees in perfect unison? 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4. It was not just about physical health, it was a powerful ritual of unity. Standing shoulder to shoulder with your neighbors and colleagues, you felt like a crucial part of a massive, breathing machine. There was a profound comfort in knowing that millions of people across the country were making the exact same movements to the exact same music at the exact same moment. It washed away the sleepiness and prepared our spirits for a day of hard work. Today, people jog alone with earphones blocking out the world, but back then, our mornings began with a shared, loud, and joyful declaration that we were all in this together. Let us talk about the unwritten rule of marriage, the legendary San Da Jian, or the Three Greats. If a young man wanted to start a family, love alone was not enough. He needed to prove his ability to provide. The absolute requirements were a bicycle, a sewing machine, and a wristwatch. I want you to remember the immense pride of wearing a mechanical Shanghai brand watch. The leather strap against the skin, the quiet, reassuring ticking close to your ear when you lay in bed. It was a massive investment, often costing several months of a worker's salary. Then there was the sewing machine, usually a heavy, black cast-iron beauty with golden floral decals. It sat in the corner of the room like a sacred altar. When a bride brought these items into her new home, they were polished and protected like priceless treasures. They represented stability, progress, and hope for a better future. People would come over just to admire the smooth mechanism of the sewing machine, or the gleam of the bicycle spokes. These were not disposable goods to be replaced next year. They were lifetime companions, destined to be passed down to the next generation. Today, young couples buy apartments and cars, but the sheer, trembling joy of finally acquiring those three greats is an emotion that modern wealth simply cannot buy. Think back to the unspoken rules of fashion and fabric. In the 1970s, the streets were a sweeping, unified ocean of blue, green, and gray. The rule was modesty and durability. Do you remember the rough, heavy feel of pure cotton work clothes, or the stiff, slightly shiny texture of the newly introduced Dacron fabric? Dacron was a miracle because it did not wrinkle easily, though it offered absolutely no warmth in the winter. The most important rule, however, was that no piece of clothing was ever thrown away. A hole in the knee or a frayed collar was simply an opportunity for our mothers to demonstrate their incredible skill. I remember the colorful, slightly mismatched patches sewn onto the elbows of my jacket. Wearing patched clothes was never a mark of shame. On the contrary, it was a badge of honor, a sign that you came from a thrifty, virtuous, and hard-working family. Sweaters were unraveled, the crinkled yarn soaked and straightened, and then knitted into a slightly smaller sweater for a younger sibling. The rhythmic clicking of knitting needles in the dim evening light was the soundtrack of our mother's endless love. We had so few clothes, but we cherished each thread, washing them carefully and folding them neatly, honoring the labor that went into making them. Let us recall the magical rule of the open-air cinema, the Luqian Dianying. Going to the movies was not a simple transaction of buying a ticket and sitting in a plush chair. It was a grand communal event that required strategy and physical effort. The rule was that you had to claim your territory early. Hours before dusk, children would carry small wooden or bamboo stools from their homes, sprinting to the village square or the factory yard to secure a spot in the front rows. I can still smell the dusty earth and the scent of mosquito coils burning in the warm summer air. Then came the projectionist, a figure of absolute authority. We would watch in awe as the massive reels were loaded onto the rattling mechanical projector. When the bright beam of light finally cut through the darkness, striking the white canvas sheet tied between two trees, a collective hush fell over the crowd. The image would often flicker, and the sheet would ripple gently in the evening breeze, making the actors seem as if they were floating. Hundreds of neighbors sat shoulder to shoulder, laughing together, weeping together, completely spellbound by the glowing screen. It was our only window to a wider world, and sharing that window with everyone we knew made the magic infinitely more powerful. Now let us bring to mind the daily rule of the enamel wash basin. Every morning began and every evening ended with this simple, beautiful object. The classic design was a pristine white interior with a bright red rim, often decorated at the bottom with a pair of mandarin ducks, or the red character for double happiness. Do you remember the sharp, echoing sound of hot water being poured from the thermos into the metal basin? It was the alarm clock of the household. Over the years, from accidental drops on the hard floor, the enamel would chip away, revealing the dark, raw iron underneath. But the rule was that a chipped basin was perfectly fine. It just meant it had character and a history. The entire family would share this one basin. You would wash your face in the morning, soaking a rough cotton towel in the steaming water, wringing it out, and pressing the hot, damp cloth against your cheeks. It woke you up in the most gentle, comforting way imaginable. At night it was used to soak tired feet after a long day of labor. That chipped metal basin was a silent witness to our daily fatigue and our daily renewal, a humble vessel that held the warmth and the resilience of the entire family. Let us drift into the warm, humid nights of summer, and the rule of the palm leaf fan, the pushan. Without air conditioning, the only way to survive the stifling heat was to move life outdoors. The rule was to carry your bamboo beds and wooden lounge chairs into the narrow alleys or the open courtyards as soon as the sun went down. I want you to remember the distinctive, dry, rustling sound of the woven palm leaves cutting through the heavy air. Grandmothers would sit for hours, gently waving those large, heart-shaped fans, creating a sweet, rhythmic breeze. They fanned themselves, but mostly they fanned the sleeping grandchildren to keep the vicious mosquitoes at bay. The scent of the night was a mixture of jasmine, damp earth, and the pungent smoke of burning mugwort. Under the dim, yellowish glow of the street lamp, neighbors would gather in their undershirts, sipping weak tea from glass jars, playing chess, and telling old ghost stories until the air finally cooled. The palm leaf fan was not just a tool. It was an extension of our elders' hands, a rhythmic expression of their boundless patience and care. Those slow, lazy summer nights, cooled by human effort and shared stories, hold the fondest memories of our childhood. We must also remember the grand winter ritual of the public bathhouse, the Zao Tang. Because our cramped homes had no running hot water and no central heating, bathing in the dead of winter was impossible. The rule was a weekly pilgrimage to the neighborhood bathhouse. Can you remember pushing through the heavy, padded cotton curtain at the entrance? Instantly you were hit by a wall of dense, suffocatingly warm steam, and the incredibly loud, echoing roar of splashing water and shouting voices. The air smelled of cheap, alkaline soap and wet, warm skin. You would strip down in the freezing changing room, rushing quickly into the humid bathing area. The water in the large tiled pools was scalding hot, but after the initial shock, it seeped into your cold bones, bringing profound relief. The most important rule of the bathhouse was the scrubbing. Friends, family, and even strangers would offer to scrub your back with a rough, synthetic towel until your skin turned bright red. All the dirt, all the exhaustion of the grueling work week was physically scrubbed away. Stepping back out into the freezing winter air, your hair still damp, your body radiating a deep inner heat, you felt entirely reborn, completely and wonderfully clean. Let us talk about the strict rules of the kitchen, specifically the absolute reverence for pork fat and lard. In those years, meat was a rare luxury, strictly rationed by meat coupons. When our mothers finally managed to buy a piece of pork, the rule was never to ask for the lean meat. You always begged the butcher for the thickest piece of white fat. I want you to remember the glorious, intoxicating smell that filled the apartment when that fat was slowly rendered in the hot wok. The crackling, popping sound of the melting fat was music to our ears. The resulting snow-white lard was carefully poured into a ceramic jar and stored like precious gold. On ordinary days, when the meal was just plain rice and boiled cabbage, Mother would take a tiny scoop of that solid white lard and bury it in the center of a bowl of piping hot rice. A few drops of dark soy sauce were added on top. As you stirred, the heat melted the lard, coating every single grain of rice in a rich, savory, glistening glaze. That simple bowl of lard-mixed rice, eaten in the dim light of the kitchen, provided a level of intense, pure happiness and comfort that the most expensive modern banquets can never hope to achieve. Do you remember the chaotic, wonderful rule of the neighborhood television? In the late 1970s and early 1980s, owning a small 9-inch black-and-white television set made you the king of the courtyard. The unspoken rule was that this magical box belonged to everyone. On a summer evening, a family would place the heavy television set on a small table near the open door. By the time the broadcast started, dozens of neighbors, carrying their own stools, had packed into the tiny living room and spilled out into the courtyard. I remember the frustrating static, the snow on the screen, and the father constantly adjusting the two metal rabbit ear antennas to get a clear picture. The room was dark, illuminated only by the bluish, flickering light from the small screen. When the heroes in the drama triumphed, the entire room erupted in cheers. When tragedy struck, You could hear the collective sniffling of the grandmothers. We were completely captivated. We did not mind the terrible picture quality or the cramped, sweaty room. Watching television was not an isolated, silent activity. It was a loud, shared, emotional journey, binding the community together through the flickering shadows of that miraculous little screen. Let us revisit the agonizing, beautiful rule of letters and telegrams. Today we send thoughts across the globe in a fraction of a second, but back then, communication demanded patience and profound respect. Do you remember the thin, translucent writing paper, printed with neat red squares? Writing a letter was a deliberate ritual. You poured your deepest emotions into those squares, folded the paper carefully into a standard envelope, and walked to the dark green postbox on the corner. Then began the rule of waiting. You waited weeks for a reply. When the postman finally shouted your name in the courtyard, holding that stamped envelope, your heart would race. But even more powerful was the telegram. A telegram was not used for casual chat. It was reserved for the most monumental moments of life: a birth, a death, an urgent return. I can still hear the rapid, sharp ringing of the telegram delivery bicycle racing down the alley. Seeing that slip of paper, with its brief, mechanically printed words, brought an immediate surge of adrenaline. Every word cost money, so the messages were incredibly brief, yet they carried the heaviest emotional weight imaginable. The distance between us felt vast, which made every word we received infinitely precious. Think back to the golden rule of repair. In our era, the concept of throwing something away simply because it was broken did not exist. The rule was that everything could, and must, be fixed. I want you to remember the symphony of the street craftsman. There was the cobbler sitting on a tiny stool, his hands stained black with polish, turning the crank of his heavy sewing machine to resole a worn-out shoe. There was the tinker, who wandered the alleys shouting his trade, carrying a small charcoal forge. If your aluminum pot had a hole in it, you did not buy a new one, you brought it to him. I loved watching the bright sparks as he welded a small metal patch over the hole, hammering it flat with incredibly rapid, precise strikes. Even broken porcelain bowls were mended using tiny metal staples. Umbrellas were rewired, scissors were sharpened on spinning whetstones, and fountain pens were fitted with new bladders. We respected our belongings. We understood the labor that went into making them, and we believed that with a little care and skilled hands, everything deserved a second, third, or fourth life. It taught us to value what we had, a lesson deeply forgotten in today's throwaway culture. Let us take a moment to reflect on the strict rule of travel and the hukou system. In our youth, the world was vast, mysterious, and largely out of reach. The rule was that you stayed where your household registration dictated. You could not simply buy a ticket and decide to visit another province for the weekend. To travel, you needed an official letter of introduction from your work unit, stamped with the formidable red seal. Without that letter, you could not buy a train ticket, and you certainly could not secure a bed in a guest house. Because of these rules, taking a long-distance train was a monumental, life-altering event. Do you remember the overwhelming smell of the green-skinned train carriages? A mixture of coal smoke, instant noodles, wet tea leaves, and thousands of packed human bodies. The rhythmic, loud clacking of the wheels on the tracks, as the train slowly chugged across the vast countryside, was the sound of true adventure. You would sit on the hard wooden seats for days, sharing sunflower seeds and life stories with complete strangers opposite you. The restriction on our movement made the rare opportunity to travel an unforgettable, cherished epic, etched deeply into our memories. We must also talk about the rule of the glass jars and the infinite utility of discarded things. A good household never let a container go to waste. Do you remember those thick glass jars that originally contained sweet canned peaches or malted milk extract? Once empty, they underwent a glorious transformation. The rule was that they became the ultimate, indestructible tea mugs. I can clearly see the metal lids, often rusting slightly at the edges, being unscrewed by an uncle or a grandfather. Inside, dark green tea leaves floated in the boiling water. The glass would get so hot you could barely hold it, but it was perfect for warming your hands in winter. And it was not just jars. Every piece of cotton string from a package was carefully untied, smoothed out, and rolled into a growing ball of twine in the drawer. Every scrap of wrapping paper was flattened and saved for a future use. The drawers of our homes were treasure chests of salvaged materials. This was not hoarding. It was a deeply ingrained respect for resources. We found beauty and profound usefulness in things others had discarded, creating a home that was incredibly resourceful, practical, and filled with the comforting weight of saved treasures. Finally, let us return to the place where our sustenance was measured. The neighborhood grain store, the Liang Dian. I promised you a sound, and it is here, amidst the heavy sacks of flour and rice. When you walked into the dim, dusty store, clutching your grain coupons and your empty cloth sacks, the air smelled intensely of raw flour and earthy rice. The clerk, wearing a white apron dusted with powder, would weigh your allocation using a large wooden steelyard balance. But the sound that truly governed this ritual, the sound that dictated the survival of the family, was the sharp, incredibly rapid clacking of the wooden abacus. The clerk's fingers would fly across the beads with dizzying speed. Clack, clack, clack. It was the sound of absolute precision. There were no digital scales, no cash registers, just the brilliant mind of the clerk and the polished wooden beads of the abacus. That sound meant our coupons were verified, our money was calculated, and we would have food for the next 30 days. Carrying the heavy sack of rice back home on the back of the bicycle, our hearts felt full and secure. The clacking of the abacus was the rhythmic soundtrack of our daily survival, a sound of certainty in a difficult world. My dear friend, as we open our eyes and return to the fast-paced digital world of today, what is it that we truly feel? We do not just miss the heavy bicycles, the chipped enamel basins, or the rough texture of the grain coupons. What we profoundly miss is the feeling of our youth. We miss the slow, deliberate pace of time. We miss the profound patience it took to live, and the deep, unbreakable bonds we shared with our neighbors when our doors were always open to one another. Life was hard, but it was incredibly sincere. If this journey back in time brought a smile to your face or a tear to your eye, please subscribe to our channel and like this video so we can continue to preserve these precious memories together. Now, I want to ask you, what is the one specific smell or sound that instantly transports you back to the courtyard of your childhood? Is it the smell of honeycomb coal or the sound of the morning radio? Please write your story in the comments below. I promise to read them, for your memories are the true history of our generation. Until we meet again, take care of yourself and never let go of those beautiful days.